Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic was inspired by multiple commenters, including Harry Marsden and Christian Morales. They requested a video about Huan, the Hound of Valinor. It's a great suggestion, though as I did the research, I thought I'd add an aspect, comparing Huan to Carcharoth, the Red Maw. So, let's get to it. First, why compare the two? Well, there's the obvious parallel in that they're both canines, in form at least. They're both creatures sharing a prophecy, and it's not an accident that the one place these two characters show up just happens to be the same story. The tale of Beren and Luthien. Tolkien wrote Huan and Carcharoth as mirror images of each other, each the other's nemesis. Let's start with Huan's backstory. Tolkien actually changed his mind on the nature of Huan. Originally, he saw Huan as a Maya spirit in the form of a dog, so in the same tier of spirits as Gandalf and Sauron. Here are some of his notes published in Morgoth's Ring. At the bottom of the page, my father jotted down the following, entirely unconnected with the matter of the text. Living things in Aman. As the Valar would robe themselves like the children, many of the Maiar robed themselves like other lesser living things, as trees, flowers, beasts, in parentheses, Huan. Obviously, that note is a strong indication that Huan is a Maya spirit in the form of a dog. However, at a later date, Tolkien walked this idea back. We have additional notes from Morgoth's Ring in which he appears to be figuring this out in real time. As you'll see, Tolkien places Huan in the same grouping as the giant eagles. He uses the name Sarontar. That was the early name for Thorondor, Lord of the Eagles. But the true rational creatures, speaking peoples, are all of human/humanoid form. Only the Valar and Maiar are intelligences that can assume forms of Arda at will. Huan and Sarontor could be Maiar, emissaries of Manwë, but unfortunately, in the Lord of the Rings, Gwaihir and Landroval are said to be descendants of Sarontar. I think it must be assumed that talking is not necessarily the sign of the possession of a rational soul, or Fëa. In the Lord of the Rings, Sauron is said to have devised a language for orcs. The same sort of thing may be said of Huan and the Eagles. They were taught language by the Valar, and raised to a higher level, but they still had no Fëar. So at that time, if you noticed, Tolkien was saying that orcs have no souls, Fëar. And he's saying the same thing about Huan and the Eagles. They are a higher level of creature, but they are not Maiar spirits. Just to muddy the waters even further, he made another note, shortly before he died, published in The Nature of Middle-earth, in which he described, quote, Maiar who took the form of the mighty speaking eagles. So it's tough to know whether Huan is a Maya or not. I tend to think he's not. As you'll see, he is a hound of the Vala Orome, and Orome gives him to the elf Celegorm. That's a bit presumptuous if Huan is truly a Maya spirit. I think a good analogy for Huan would be Shadowfax, the paragon of horses, one of the Maeros, horses that legend says were brought from the west by Orome. Orome knows his dogs and his horses. Just to clarify the time period we're talking about here, this is in the First Age, thousands of years before the War of the Ring. Here's the quote from the Silmarillion in which we learn about Huan and Orome. It chanced that Celegorm and Curufin went on a hunt through the guarded plain, and this they did because Sauron, being filled with suspicion, sent forth many wolves into the elf lands. Therefore they took their hounds and rode forth. Now the chief of the wolfhounds that followed Celegorm was named Huan. He was not born in Middle-earth, but came from the Blessed Realm. For Orome had given him to Celegorm long ago in Valinor, and there he had followed the horn of his master, before evil came. Huan followed Celegorm into exile, and was faithful, and thus he too came under the doom of woe set upon the Noldor, and it was decreed that he should meet death, but not until he encountered the mightiest wolf that would ever walk the world. That's a fascinating backstory. Celegorm is one of the 7 sons of Feanor. They made the dreadful Oath of Feanor, their dad, defying the Valar, and received the doom of Mandos as a result. Well, because Huan was loyal to his master, Celegorm, and decided to keep following him to Middle-earth, the doom affected Huan as well. It wasn't just the elves. It was anyone following Feanor, loyal hounds included. And you'll see this loyalty tested to the point of breaking eventually, but not before the pronouncement of the doom. But the prophecy adds a stipulation. They will not die until he encounters, quote, the mightiest wolf that would ever walk the world. That's some quality myth-making right there. So now we enter the tale of Beren and Luthien, in which Huan and Carcharoth are major players. Beren and Finrod have gone off to take the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown, per King Thingol's seemingly impossible request, and they've been captured by Sauron. Luthien goes off on her own, searching for Beren, when she comes across Celegorm and Huan in the forest. And here, we're going to learn some more about Huan's abilities. Huan it was that found Luthien flying like a shadow, surprised by the daylight under the trees, when Celegorm and Curufin rested a while near to the western eaves of Doriath. For nothing could escape the sight and scent of Huan, nor could any enchantment stay him, and he slept not, neither by night nor day. He brought her to Celegorm, and Luthien, learning that he was a prince of the Noldor and a foe of Morgoth, was glad, and she declared herself, casting aside her cloak. So great was her sudden beauty revealed beneath the sun, that Celegorm became enamored of her. But he spoke her fair, and promised that she should find help in her need, if she returned with him now to Nargothrond. By no sign did he reveal that he knew already of Beren and the quest of which she told, nor that it was a matter which touched him near. So we learn that Huan is literally tireless, and is arguably the greatest tracker in Tolkien's mythology, puts the Rangers to shame. And it says, nothing could escape the sight and scent of Huan, nor could any enchantment stay him. He brings Luthien back to Celegorm. Celegorm is a Noldor prince. He promises to help her, so she goes with him. But Celegorm is a terrible individual, maybe the most despicable of the 7 sons of Feanor. He sees this as a chance for political power play, so he and his brother Curufin kidnap Luthien and send a message to her father, King Thingol, demanding that Thingol support a marriage between Luthien and Celegorm, thus elevating Celegorm's standing. It's pretty devious. Dare I say, dastardly. But Celegorm hasn't counted on Huan, the Hound of Valinor. But Huan the Hound was true of heart, and the love of Luthien had fallen upon him in the first hour of their meeting, and he grieved at her captivity. Therefore he came often to her chamber, and at night he lay before her door, for he felt that evil had come to Nargothrond. Luthien spoke often to Huan in her loneliness, telling of Beren, who was the friend of all birds and beasts that did not serve Morgoth. And Huan understood all that was said, for he comprehended the speech of all things with voice. But it was permitted to him thrice only, ere his death, to speak with words. Now Huan devised a plan for the aid of Luthien, and coming at a time of night, he brought her cloak, and for the first time he spoke, giving her counsel. Then he led her by secret ways out of Nargothrond, and they fled north together. And he humbled his pride and suffered her to ride upon him in the fashion of a steed, even as the orcs did at times upon great wolves. Thus they made great speed, for Huan was swift and tireless. So here we learn even more about Huan. First, he understands the speech of all things with voice, which is hardly surprising if you've ever been associated with dogs. One of my favorite canine companions was a Scottie named Mortimer. And you could call Mortimer to come in from the backyard all day long. Mortimer! Mortimer! But as soon as you said, Biscuit, this little blur would race past you into the kitchen. Little pause. Anyway. Here we also get more of the prophecy swirling around Huan. We're told it was permitted to him thrice only ere his death to speak with words. And he uses one of those precious 3 allotments in this moment to help Luthien escape. And we're told he humbles his pride, acting as her horse, like the great wolves ridden by the orcs. Similar to what we see much later in the Third Age with the Wog Riders. It does make me wonder, how did Huan know he could only speak 3 times ere his death? I'm picturing Mandos, or his herald, pronouncing the doom to the elves, and then saying, "All right, you can all go now. The rest is for the dog. All right, you can only talk 3 times. You're going to meet up with a giant wolf." Somehow he knew. So Huan takes Luthien to the Isle of Werewolves, where Beren is being held by Sauron. And as they stand on the bridge leading to the isle, Luthien sings a song, and Beren, hearing her voice, responds with a song of his own. But Luthien heard Beren's answering voice, and she sang then a song of greater power. The wolves howled, and the isle trembled. Sauron stood in the high tower, wrapped in his black thought. But he smiled, hearing her voice, for he knew that it was the daughter of Melian. The fame of the beauty of Luthien and the wonder of her song had long gone forth from Doriath, and he thought to make her captive and hand her over to the power of Morgoth, for his reward would be great. Therefore he sent a wolf to the bridge, but Huan slew it silently. Still Sauron sent others one by one, and one by one Huan took them by the throat and slew them. Then Sauron sent Draugluin, a dread beast, old and evil, lord and sire of the werewolves of Angband. His might was great, and the battle of Huan and Draugluin was long and fierce. Yet at length Draugluin escaped, and fleeing back into the tower, he died before Sauron's feet. And as he died, he told his master, "Huan is there." Now Sauron knew well, as did all in that land, the fate that was decreed for the Hound of Valinor. And it came into his thought that he himself would accomplish it. Therefore he took upon himself the form of a werewolf, and made himself the mightiest that had yet walked the world. And he came forth to win the passage of the bridge. This is a fantastic sequence, and it answers the question of, why did Sauron take the form of a werewolf for this fight? So in order to capture Luthien, Sauron first sends waves of werewolves to retrieve her. Huan kills them all. Then he sends the father of werewolves, the legendary Draugluin. Draugluin is no slouch, certainly one of the mightiest wolves to ever walk the world. Top 5, probably? But he gets whooped, barely manages to crawl back to Sauron and say, "It's Huan," before he dies. Knowing the prophecy of Huan, Sauron decides to manipulate the prophecy into coming true by transforming into what he considers to be the world's mightiest werewolf. Tad bit overconfident, a trait that will come back to haunt him in later years as well. So great was the horror of his approach that Huan leaped aside. Then Sauron sprang upon Luthien, and she swooned before the menace of the fell spirit in his eyes and the foul vapor of his breath. But even as he came, falling, she cast a fold of her dark cloak before his eyes, and he stumbled, for a fleeting drowsiness came upon him. Then Huan sprang. There befell the battle of Huan and Wolf Sauron, and the howls and baying echoed in the hills, and the watchers on the walls of arid Wethrin across the valley heard it afar, and were dismayed. But no wizardry nor spell, neither fang nor venom, nor devil's art nor beast strength, could overthrow Huan of Valinor, and he took his foe by the throat and pinned him down. Then Sauron shifted shape, from wolf to serpent, and from monster to his own accustomed form. But he could not elude the grip of Huan without forsaking his body utterly, ere his foul spirit left its dark house. Luthien came to him and said that he should be stripped of his raiment of flesh, and his ghost be sent quaking back to Morgoth. And she said, "There everlastingly thy naked self shall endure the torment of his scorn, pierced by his eyes, unless thou yield to me the mastery of thy tower." And so Huan defeats Sauron in single combat. It's a nice achievement to be able to put on your resume. And he holds Sauron down until he relents to Luthien's demands. The text mentions that so great was the horror of his approach that Huan leaped aside. I wonder if in that moment, Huan thought, maybe this is the mightiest wolf. Maybe this is my time. But of course, he fights on anyway. Maybe he thought, you know what, I still get to speak 2 more times. I'm safe. Finrod's body has been slain, but Beren has been freed, so Huan returns to his master Celegorm. But Tolkien notes, yet their love was less than before. Then Celegorm and Curufin get banished from Nargothrond. And even though Curufin's son, Celebrimbor, yes, that Celebrimbor, rejects his father and stays at Nargothrond, Huan faithfully follows his master Celegorm. So Huan has more loyalty to that duo than Curufin's own son. Sometime later, Celegorm, Curufin, and Huan are wandering through the forest of Brethil. And whom should they see strolling through the forest? That's right, Beren and Luthien. Being the jerks that they were, Celegorm and Curufin probably blamed Beren and Luthien for their banishment. So they take them by surprise. Curufin rides up and grabs Luthien, and Celegorm tries to charge Beren on his horse. It's decision time for Huan. Then Beren sprang from before Celegorm, full upon the speeding horse of Curufin that had passed him. And the leap of Beren is renowned among men and elves. He took Curufin by the throat from behind and hurled him backward, and they fell to the ground together. The horse reared and fell, but Luthien was flung aside and lay upon the grass. Then Beren throttled Curufin, but death was near him, for Celegorm rode upon him with a spear. In that hour, Huan forsook the service of Celegorm and sprang upon him, so that his horse swerved aside and would not approach Beren because of the terror of the great Hound. Celegorm cursed both Hound and horse, but Huan was unmoved. Then Luthien, rising, forbade the slaying of Curufin, but Beren despoiled him of his gear and weapons, and took his knife, Angrist. Then Curufin cursed Beren under cloud and sky. "Go hence," he said, "unto a swift and bitter death." And the brothers made then as if to ride away. And Beren turned away and took no heed of their words. But Curufin, being filled with shame and malice, took the bow of Celegorm and shot back as they went, and the arrow was aimed at Luthien. Huan leaped, but Curufin shot again, and Beren sprang before Luthien, and the dart smote him in the breast. It is told that Huan pursued the sons of Feanor, and they fled in fear. And returning, he brought to Luthien a herb out of the forest. With that leaf she staunched Beren's wound, and by her arts and by her love she healed him, and thus at last they returned to Doriath. So this is the moment when Celegorm's jerk threshold gets so high that Huan finally rejects him and saves the lives of both Beren and Luthien in the process. Then, after Beren takes a treacherous Curufin arrow to the chest, Huan chases off the sons of Feanor, then finds and collects a healing herb and brings it back to save Beren's life for the second time that afternoon. The more I read the tale of Beren and Luthien from Huan's point of view, the more I realize how incredibly important he is to this story. He doesn't just help the heroes at one particular moment. He is integral to every step of the quest. One side note, the text mentions that Beren disarms Curufin, taking the knife Angrist in the process. That knife is important later, in that Beren uses it to pry a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. It breaks during an attempt on the second gem, but it also has a connection to the wider lore. It was forged by the dwarf Telkar, the master smith who also forged Turin's dragon helm, and most notably, Narsil, the sword of Elendil. And I just thought of this, but Angrist breaks during an assault of sorts on Morgoth, and Narsil breaks during an assault on Sauron. Okay, now that our heroes are safely back in Doriath, Beren again tries to go after the Silmarils on his own, and once again, Luthien and Huan go in pursuit. Huan has the idea to acquire the pelts of Draugluin, the now deceased father of werewolves, and the vampire Thringwithil's bat form. We assume he had to slay her as well, but that fight is not written out. Huan and Luthien catch up with Beren. Beren laments having endangered Luthien through his actions, and Huan uses his second allotted monologue to give Beren some advice. "Thrice now I curse my oath to Thingol," Beren said, "and I would that he had slain me in Menegroth, rather than I should bring you under the shadow of Morgoth." Then for the second time, Huan spoke with words, and he counseled Beren, saying, "From the shadow of death you can no longer save Luthien, for by her love she is now subject to it. You can turn from your fate and lead her into exile, seeking peace in vain while your life lasts. But if you will not deny your doom, then either Luthien, being forsaken, must assuredly die alone, or she must with you challenge the fate that lies before you. Hopeless, yet not certain. Further counsel I cannot give, nor may I go further on your road. But my heart forebodes that what you find at the gate, I shall myself see. All else is dark to me, yet it may be that our three paths shall lead back to Doriath, and we may meet before the end." Then Beren perceived that Luthien could not be divided from the doom that lay upon them both, and he sought no longer to dissuade her. By the counsel of Huan and the arts of Luthien, he was arrayed now in the hame of Draugluin, and she in the winged fell of Thringwithil. Beren became in all things like a werewolf to look upon, save that in his eyes there shone a spirit grim indeed, but clean. And horror was in his glance as he saw upon his flank a bat-like creature clinging with creased wings. Then, howling under the moon, he leaped down the hill, and the bat wheeled and flittered above him. So Huan temporarily leaves the story. Enter his nemesis, Carcharoth. Huan foreshadows their meeting when he says, "My heart forebodes that what you find at the gate, I shall myself see." I think he realizes that he's still bound to the fate of our heroes. Beren and Luthien ride up to Angband. I've had some folks tell me it should be pronounced Angband, but I've heard it both ways, so I'm going with Angband for this video. Anyway, Beren and Luthien ride up to Angband and find something truly horrible awaiting them. Before them was the impregnable gate, an arch wide and dark at the foot of the mountain. Above it reared 1,000 feet of precipice. There dismay took them, for at the gate was a guard of whom no tidings had yet gone forth. Rumor of designs abroad among the princes of the elves had come to Morgoth, and ever down the aisles of the forest was heard the baying of Huan, the great Hound of War, whom long ago the Valar unleashed. Then Morgoth recalled the doom of Huan, and he chose one from among the whelps of the race of Draugluin, and he fed him with his own hand upon living flesh, and put his power upon him. Swiftly the wolf grew until he could creep into no den, but lay huge and hungry before the feet of Morgoth. There the fire and anguish of hell entered into him, and he became filled with a devouring spirit, tormented, terrible, and strong. Carcharoth, the Red Maw he was named in the tales of those days, and Anfauglir, the Jaws of Thirst. And Morgoth set him to lie unsleeping before the doors of Angband, lest Huan come. So now we know why Draugluin and Werewolf Sauron weren't considered the mightiest wolves to ever walk the world. Carcharoth is guarding the gates of Angband, like Cerberus guarding Hades. Much like Sauron tried to manipulate Huan's prophecy, Morgoth does the same. Oh, Huan's gonna be killed by the greatest wolf that ever lived? Let's make it. And so he personally raises Carcharoth from a pup. And I think the most important line there is that Morgoth, quote, put his power upon him. Carcharoth is a supernaturally powered-up werewolf. He is to wolves perhaps what Glaurung is to dragons. They're both alive at this point, Glaurung and Carcharoth. Both spent a lot of time in Angband, and both represent the pinnacle of Morgoth's transformational powers. We also see a bit of a nature versus nurture contrast here between Huan and Carcharoth. Both are canines of a kind, but one was raised by the Valar, and the other raised by Morgoth. So Carcharoth is as much a product of his upbringing as he is of bearing the title werewolf. Now, Carcharoth is aware that his sire, Draugluin, is dead. So when he sees Draugluin walking up to the gates, it understandably throws him off. Now Carcharoth espied them from afar, and he was filled with doubt, for news had long been brought to Angband that Draugluin was dead. Therefore, when they approached, he denied them entry and bade them stand, and he drew near with menace, scenting something strange in the air about them. But suddenly some power, descended from old of divine race, possessed Luthien, and casting back her foul raiment she stood forth, small before the might of Carcharoth, but radiant and terrible. Lifting up her hand, she commanded him to sleep, saying, O woe-begotten spirit, fall now into dark oblivion, and forget for a while the dreadful doom of life. And Carcharoth was felled, as though lightning had smitten him. Luthien, with her Maya-inspired abilities, cast a sleep spell on Carcharoth. Note part of the text from her spell. Fall now into dark oblivion, and forget for a while the dreadful doom of life. First of all, there's almost a kindness built into it. I'm going to let you temporarily escape the misery and horror of your existence. There's an air of pity in those words, which, as we know, is a trait that Tolkien values, perhaps above all others. Also, the phrase doom of life is notable. Tolkien often used the term doom in the Silmarillion in reference to judgment or prophecy. And it's a reminder that Carcharoth's life is interwoven with the doom of Mandos. He's been raised to fulfill the prophecy regarding Huan. Okay, so Carcharoth is asleep. Beren and Luthien enter Angband. Luthien puts the whole place to sleep. Beren cuts a Silmaril off Morgoth's crown with Angrist. The knife breaks trying to acquire the second Silmaril. Morgoth and the rest of Angband start to wake up, and it's time for Beren and Luthien to run for their lives. Then terror fell upon Beren and Luthien, and they fled, heedless and without disguise, desiring only to see the light once more. They were neither hindered nor pursued, but the gate was held against their going out, for Carcharoth had risen from sleep, and stood now in wrath upon the threshold of Angband. Before they were aware of him, he saw them, and sprang upon them as they ran. Luthien was spent, and she had not time nor strength to quell the wolf. But Beren strode forth before her, and in his right hand he held aloft the Silmaril. Carcharoth halted, and for a moment was afraid. "Get you gone and fly," cried Beren, "for here is a fire that shall consume you and all evil things." And he thrust the Silmaril before the eyes of the wolf. But Carcharoth looked upon that holy jewel and was not daunted, and the devouring spirit within him awoke to sudden fire. And gaping, he took suddenly the hand within his jaws, and he bit it off at the wrist. Then swiftly all his innards were filled with the flame of anguish, and the Silmaril seared his accursed flesh. Howling he fled before them, and the walls of the Valley of the Gate echoed with the clamor of his torment. So terrible did he become in his madness, that all the creatures of Morgoth that abode in that valley, or were upon any of the roads that led thither, fled far away. For he slew all living things that stood in his path, and burst from the north with ruin upon the world. Of all the terrors that came ever into Beleriand ere Angban's fall, the madness of Carcharoth was the most dreadful, for the power of the Silmaril was hidden within him. Carcharoth bites off Berin's right hand, swallowing the hand and the Silmaril it holds. Being a creature raised in Angban by Morgoth, Carcharoth cannot bear the searing light of the Silmaril, and it burns him from the inside, making him run throughout the land, killing everything in his path in a crazed, pain-filled frenzy. Tolkien describes it as the most dreadful terror to ever come into Beleriand during the First Age. Beren and Luthien are then rescued by the Eagles, led by Thorondor, who I mentioned in an earlier quote. It was Huan who instructed the Eagles to keep watch in case Beren and Luthien needed their aid. So, Huan comes through yet again. I'll note that Carcharoth biting off Beren's hand is almost certainly inspired by Norse mythology, in which the Fenris wolf, spawn of Loki, bites off the hand of the god Tyr. So now Beren comes before Thingol, requesting permission to marry Luthien, since he has returned. This short passage doesn't mention Huan or Carcharoth, though it certainly involves Carcharoth. But I'm reading it because it's just a badass engagement between Beren and Thingol. But Beren knelt before him and said, "I return according to my word. I am come now to claim my own." And Thingol answered, "What of your quest, and of your vow?" But Beren said, "It is fulfilled. Even now, a Silmaril is in my hand." Then Thingol said, "Show it to me." And Beren put forth his left hand, slowly opening its fingers, but it was empty. Then he held up his right arm, and from that hour he named himself Camlost, the Empty-Handed. Bang! That's how you do it. I got your Silmaril. It's in my hand. It just so happens my hand is in a wolf's stomach. Loophole! Camlost, the Empty-Handed. That's quality. Thingol accepts this response and permits the marriage to take place. Happy days! But there's still a giant, crazed wolf terrorizing the countryside. But now a shadow fell upon the joy of Doriath at the return of Luthien the Fair. For learning of the cause of the madness of Carcharoth, the people grew the more afraid, perceiving that his danger was fraught with dreadful power because of the holy jewel, and hardly might be overthrown. And Beren, hearing of the onslaught of the wolf, understood that the quest was not yet fulfilled. Therefore, since daily Carcharoth drew nearer to Menegroth, they prepared the hunting of the wolf. Of all pursuits of beasts, wherefore tales tell, the most perilous. To that chase went Huan, the Hound of Valinor, and Mablung of the Heavy Hand, and Belig Strongbow, and Beren, and Thingol, King of Doriath. But Luthien remained behind at the gates of Menegroth. A dark shadow fell upon her, and it seemed to her that the sun had sickened and turned black. Beren keeps leaving Luthien behind when he goes off on these quests. Hasn't he learned by now that her powers are insanely useful? But the hunt is on, and it's time for Huan and Carcharoth to fulfill their destiny. This is a longer passage, but as the thrilling conclusion to our story, I think it deserves to be read as a single unit. The hunters turned east and north, and following the course of the river, they came at last upon Carcharoth the wolf, in a dark valley, down the northern side whereof Escalduin fell into a torrent over steep falls. At the foot of the falls, Carcharoth drank to ease his consuming thirst, and he howled, and thus they were aware of him. But he, espying their approach, rushed not suddenly to attack them. It may be that the devil's cunning of his heart awoke, being for a moment eased of his pain by the sweet waters of Escalduin. Even as they rode towards him, he slunk aside into a deep brake, and there lay hid. But they set a guard about all that place, and waited, and the shadows grew long in the forest. Beren stood beside Thingol, and suddenly they were aware that Huan had left their side. Then a great baying awoke in the thicket, for Huan, becoming impatient and desiring to look upon this wolf, had gone in alone to dislodge him. But Carcharoth avoided him, and bursting from the thorns, leaped suddenly upon Thingol. Swiftly Beren strode before him with a spear, but Carcharoth swept it aside and felled him, biting at his breast. In that moment, Huan leaped from the thicket upon the back of the wolf, and they fell together, fighting bitterly. And no battle of wolf and hound has been like to it, for in the baying of Huan was heard the voice of the horns of Orome, and the wrath of the Valar. But in the howls of Carcharoth was the hate of Morgoth, and malice crueler than teeth of steel. And the rocks were rent by their clamor, and fell from on high, and choked the falls of Osgiliath. There they fought to the death. But Thingol gave no heed, for he knelt by Beren, seeing that he was sorely hurt. Huan in that hour slew Carcharoth. But there in the woven woods of Doriath his own doom, long spoken, was fulfilled, and he was mortally wounded, and the venom of Morgoth entered into him. Then he came, and falling beside Beren, spoke for the third time with words, and he bade Beren farewell before he died. Beren spoke not, but laid his hand upon the head of the hound, and so they parted. Mablung and Beleg came hastening to the king's aid, but when they looked upon what was done, they cast aside their spears and wept. Then Mablung took a knife and ripped up the belly of the wolf, and within he was well nigh all consumed as with a fire. But the hand of Beren that held the jewel was yet incorrupt. And when Mablung reached forth to touch it, the hand was no more, and the Silmaril lay there unveiled. And the light of it filled the shadows of the forest all about them. Then quickly and in fear Mablung took it and set it in Beren's living hand. And Beren was aroused by the touch of the Silmaril, and held it aloft, and bade Thingol receive it. Now is the quest achieved, he said, and my doom full wrought. And he spoke no more. They bore back Beren Camlost, son of Barahir, upon a bier of branches, with Huan the wolfhound at his side. And night fell ere they returned to Menegroth. As most of you know, this is not the end for Beren. Luthien intervenes with Mandos on their behalf. But it is the end for Huan and Carcharoth. Huan's third and final speech is a farewell to Beren, much like Finrod's farewell words. Beren puts his hand on Huan's head, and the two pass away together. Carcharoth is cut open to remove the Silmaril, and his innards have been seared. Hence the reason he was so thirsty. He was trying to soothe the fire burning inside him. And so we have two sad, tragic story arcs. Huan's loyalty gets him caught up in the doom of Mandos, which he faces with all the bravery and grace of a humanoid hero. And Carcharoth, yes, certainly a villain in the story, but a tragic one. Raised and shaped and abused by Morgoth, then driven mad by the searing fire of a Silmaril, until finally fighting and dying against the hound he was bred to destroy. It's easy to say, good riddance, but I don't think there was a single joyful day in Carcharoth's existence. And so that's the end of our tale, Huan and his nemesis, Carcharoth. Because I like to tie these Silmarillion stories to the Lord of the Rings, I'll add this short passage from The Return of the King. It's about Grond, the enchanted siege weapon used against Minas Tirith. The drums rolled louder, fires leaped up, great engines crawled across the field, and in the midst was a huge ram, great as a forest tree, 100 feet in length, swinging on mighty chains. Long had it been forging in the dark smithies of Mordor, and its hideous head, founded of black steel, was shaped in the likeness of a ravening wolf. On it spells of ruin lay. Grond they named it, in memory of the hammer of the underworld of old. Shaped in the likeness of a ravening wolf. Yes, Tolkien named it Grond, after Morgoth's weapon, but he easily could have named it Carcharoth, or the Red Maw, after Morgoth's guard dog. So, as Tolkien does so well, we see echoes of previous myths touch on the current tale that he's telling. In any case, thank you for watching this video about the Hound versus the werewolf. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.